Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore Presents with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. In this episode, I'm talking to two folklore heavyweights, Owen Davies and Ceri Houlbrook. Owen Davies is Professor of Social History at the University of Hertfordshire. He's the author of numerous books, and most recently, Art of Grimoire and Troubled by Faith, Insanity and the Supernatural in the Age of the Asylum, both in 2023. He has been described as Britain's foremost academic expert on the history of magic. Ceri Houlbrook is Senior Lecturer in Folklore and History at the University of Hertfordshire, and her books include The Magic of Coin Trees from 2018, Unlocking the Lovelock from 2021, and Ritual Litter Redressed of 2022. In addition to her scholarly work, she writes folklore-inspired fiction. In this particular episode, we chat about their new book, Folklore, A Journey Through the Past and Present, about whether folklore should actually open up to admit openly invented law, the importance of the urban environment of folklore, which has often been overlooked, and the way that social media has shifted local traditions into often international ones. There's even a mention of the folklore of ice cream vans. Enjoy! Hello and welcome both of you to Fabulous Folklore. How are you doing?
Very
Fine,
well,
thanks,
thank
Ozzy.
you.
Awesome. Obviously we're here to, in part, chat about your new book, Folklore. What's the subtitle again? A Journey Through the Past and Present. So my first question comes in two parts. And it was, what prompted you to write the book, and how did it take the shape that it did?
You want to go with that, Kerry, first?
Yeah, so I mean, it came really from our students coming into the Folklore Studies Masters program, and every year they would ask us for a key text. And there are, as you know, thousands of brilliant folklore books out there, but we really struggled to pick one out that kind of presents British folklore as a really, really broad topic that goes through the past into the present, that's constantly adapting. A book that provides kind of primary research, primary data, but also brings in kind of tools for how you can analyze it in an accessible way, really, in a way that's not necessarily written for kind of seasoned academics, but for people either new to the topic or who've touched on it before but not really delved deeply. So we wanted something that was an interesting read, but also kind of equipped the readers with these analytical tools in an easy, accessible, interesting, hopefully, way. And that was our aim with the book.
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's just, folklore can be fun and entertaining and interesting, but it's also complex and also challenging. And we wanted to get that across as well.
Yeah, I like the fact that the way you've done it in the sections as well makes it quite easy, where if you're only, say, looking at one particular area, you can just jump straight to that section.
Yeah,
And the sections obviously all feed into each other in a way, but they're separate enough that you can sort of decide where your interests lie, I guess.
yeah. Well, exactly that, isn't it? Because it's, people. I'm sure lots of people would go straight to the section that they're most interested in. Hopefully they'll read the rest of the book. But I can perfectly understand that people go straight for performance or straight for film and media or whatever. But it does add up to a whole. It's
Mm.
worth reading the whole lot.
I'm a geek. I went straight to your note on the end where he said, make sure you read the note about calendar customs. And I'm like, okay, I will. So I went off to
Good,
read the thing
excellent.
about time and calendars because that always fascinates me when people get really stuck on particular days and dates and whatnot throughout the year. And I'm like, but when was that date important? And then I get like, yeah, a bit annoying about that. Um, Obviously, as you see yourself, it's a massive topic. It's absolutely huge. So was there anything that you would like to have covered that you didn't, maybe due to space or time constraints, or was it just something that because it's still evolving, it wasn't really necessary or appropriate to include it?
We really struggled with structure. It went through many, many different drafts, didn't it? The kind of what chapters we were going to include in which sections. We knew from the outset we couldn't cover everything, and there are elements there such as kind of music, for instance, and dance, which are touched upon, but certainly not. They are worthy of whole books in themselves. So we state in the introduction that there are sections that we couldn't include, partly because other people have dealt with them so well already. But still, kind of the manuscript that we submitted was a lot, or that we kind of ended up with at the end was a lot longer than what ended up in print. So we did have to cut a lot, and it was really, really difficult. Probably one of the hardest things I've ever done, kind of publishing. But yeah, I think we were fairly confident at the start with what sections we definitely wanted to cover, and they very much represent how people engage with folklore in their everyday lives. That was our main aim when we sat down and started kind of drafting the contents.
And I think all the way through, when we're going, okay, I think we cut out about 16,000 words, something like that. But all the way through, it's kind of going, okay, we're focusing on the lore here, and so things like folk dance and folk song. Okay, there are kind of lore aspects to it, but also it's we couldn't cover the whole of folk life, and so that the decision was to say, okay, is this about lore? Is it about belief? Is it ideas? It can be about practice and performance based on ideas and beliefs and legends and whatever. So that was kind of one way of just keeping it focused. So that's where we do talk about a bit of dance and a bit of song, but it's when it's related to ideas and beliefs and customary traditions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think I was quite pleased to see that you also addressed the general lack of urban representation in folklore, because I do like folklore in cities quite a lot, and obviously it tends to be quite touristy things that you can go and interact with and stuff, but there's loads of it in cities all over Europe and so on. And I think because there's been that weird, like, romanticized view of like the present or the past rather, and a rural way of life, and I think people overlook cities because of that. But why do you think that people keep looking to the countryside for folklore instead of what's actually around them?
I mean, that starts right from the beginning of folklore, when the folklore is, and it basically comes down to survival theory. This fundamental and problematic founding notion of folklore studies. The idea that customs and beliefs, folklore was essentially a fossil or survival. It didn't develop. It didn't change. It was of its time, and that was it. It was a fossil in time. And so when folklorists are going to looking for lore and custom and tradition for these survivals, essentially, they think, well, there's no point looking in the towns and cities. They're all knowing and cunning people in the urban area. The environment isn't right. It's not connected with farming or anything like that. So what's the point? There's no point. We're only going to find these fossils in the deepest rural parts of the countryside. So apart from one guy, Edward Lovett in London, he is the only one really who thought actually there's some interesting things going on, because obviously migrants, people are coming constantly from rural areas, which is what he found. He was interviewing people in the East End, but quite a lot, 60% of them were people who were from the countryside originally and things like that. So that's the origin, and that really has set in stone, because if people want to start engaging with folklore and looking at folklore texts, all they're going to find is rural stuff, because that's what was collected. And that just sets this really problematic state for us now, as you're saying, Icy, is that if you're a folklorist trying to look at urban folklore, brilliant, you can, as Ceri does, study contemporary, but you're not going to find much of a history behind it,
How would you sort of think that works then, where, for example, I find a lot of the folklore that you do find tends to fall under the ghost story camp. Like, cities are replete with that stuff. You can't move without bumping into a white lady or something. So is that because that's perhaps seen as not having this survival theory behind it, so people can go, "Oh, ghosts, they're a different thing"?
Yeah, well, exactly. Ghosts are dependent on humans. If you see what I mean, wherever humans are, there will be ghosts, whether it's down a mine or in a city or under the water or on a ship or whatever. So that breaks free of all that. And as I've studied many times, and so there's great stories, urban stories, ghosts going back 500 years. So that's not a problem at all in understanding how ghosts operate in an urban area. But it's all the other things that custom, tradition, family, and otherwise that we do talk about in things like the chapter on domestic folklore.
Yeah, people weren't leaving these things behind as they moved into cities. They weren't just kind of shedding that skin and just losing all of their customs and traditions. They brought them with them and they adapted them, and that's a fascinating element of folklore that just has been largely ignored, as Owen said, kind of through the history of studying folklore. So I think, yeah, it's everywhere. Wherever there are people, there is folklore. And I think I've yet to find many examples of things like fairies and boggarts and things kind of haunting high-rise flats and office buildings, but they must be. It's not just ghosts. So I'm constantly on the lookout for those. They must have moved into the cities as well.
Yeah, that would explain a lot of weird things that happen where I work, I must admit. But yeah, you do sort of think if you're going to assume that, particularly with like the other world with fairies, that exists alongside ours, then are they equally annoyed at the delays on public transport? I don't know. They might be. That would be quite a cool thing to find out. But when you were talking about the idea of the survival sort of theory about these customs and things, and this is something that always fascinates me. If we accept that that is largely not the case, well, isn't the case, and that these other beliefs have sprung up from somewhere, how do we actually know where they came from? Or is that actually not really important? Is it the practice that's important rather than the origin?
I think both are important. I mean, I'm a historian as well as a folklorist, social historian. So it is, to me, I think understanding, if you're going to talk about folklore, everything has a history, even if it's just 1 year old or 10 years old or 30 years old or 300 years old. And I think it's really important. And I think we try and put that in the book. And that's why we've done a lot of primary research and using newspapers in particular as a kind of fresh news source to try and chart where these things, as far as we can tell, appear from, because that's fundamental to understanding how they subsequently develop. Good ideas, those the classic sort of calendar customs like the straw bear, Whittlesea straw bear or whatever, or green man or the berry man, who early folklorists thought were survivals of pre-Christian pagan fertility, right? And then you find, well, what are the actual earliest sources? And they're from the late 18th or early 19th century, and it's clearly people have invented it. And they're drawing upon the environment around them to create costumes. And if you want cheap materials, you're going to be using straw and you're going to be using plants and everything else to create something distinct and unique to your particular tradition in this area. And to me, one of the great things about folklore is that personal invention. If you read some folklore, you would have thought that everyone is kind of just closeted. There's a tradition, and then we adopt the tradition, or we carry on the tradition as if people didn't invent and add things to it and change things, add new songs, add music hall to Morris dancing, all those sorts of things. It takes away the agency of people across the centuries to say that it's not changing and adaptable, and that these can't be invented in the past, rather than being something deep time and.
Yeah, trying to get away from that time immemorial concept, and also getting away from the idea of authenticity. This idea, is it authentic folklore? And it's like, well, all folklore is human created. It's human creativity, and absolutely what Owen's saying. Giving people the agency. They've invented that. They've created that. So it's not inauthentic, just because it's not 300 years old. Yeah.
And the Morris movement, the early Morris dance movement, is an exact example of that, where they basically some middle class people decided to find what was the original Morris dance, and then basically excluded women from Morris for decades, because they decided that Morris was purely male and always has been, and that's the way it should be.
Mm. I think that's one of the things that I always find really interesting when people have this fixation on like what is like a British tradition, and short of queuing, you do sort of wonder, is there one? And isn't that actually one of the cool things about being British, that things get brought here and then you kind of put your own twist on them, and that is that not the tradition itself, kind of remixing things? I don't know, because I think that's one of the things I've found quite troubling a little bit with some of the stuff online, obviously recently with all the flags business and whatnot. And it's the fact that people keep harping on about our culture and our traditions. And I'm like, but surely folklore shows us that A, you can just make them up, and B, some of them are also fairly nonsensical. So how do we deal with like traditionist folklorists or people who like folklore without kind of falling into that far right sort of sense?
Yeah,
Well,
it's go on, Owen.
No, I mean we kind of tackle that in the last chapter about identities and what is English folklore, what is Welsh folklore, what is Scottish folklore. So you kind of break it down, and they've all got distinct histories. And obviously Wales and Scotland kind of invented aspects of their folklore, whether it's the invention of Highland games or the tartan or whatever, or the Welsh and various aspects of Druidism and things like that. But that was all about identity building. This is us. We're different from the English, and the English didn't. English and thing is, English and Britain gets confused, conflated. British Empire? Well, it's really the English Empire sort of kind of thing, and that's where we're stuck at the moment, because we don't have an empire. We've left the EU. Who is there to be against someone else? Because that's how we define ourselves. And then you try and pick on, customs and traditions which are supposedly English, but when you look at them, aren't. 100 years ago, people weren't celebrating St. George's Day unless you were abroad. It was British migrants who were celebrating St. Andrews and something. The people didn't think in terms of I'm English. You're from your locality. I mean, that's the other thing, isn't it? It's about locality. It's about locality and region. And contemporary notions of Englishness are really confused, and that's why they start grabbing at bits of folklore, saying that's typically English. Well, go research it and see what it really is.
Well, just that, folklore is constantly, I love the expression feeding on other matter, and that's exactly what folklore is. It's just drawing on all the different communities that have come to Britain or that have interacted with British culture. It's just this wonderful, colourful amalgamation of lots of different cultures. And yeah, there have been more recent inventions, but so much, even those recent inventions, you can kind of take elements and trace back to other cultures and other beliefs. So yeah, there is no such thing as kind of an original, authentic British or English folklore. And there's certainly no pure English folklore that we're at risk of losing. It just doesn't exist.
I mean, I've been following the what's happening in Georgia, as in not the American state, but the country, which has got it's basically been usurped by a pro-Russian government. But of course, the protests they're doing every day, it's the St. George's flag. So who owns the St. George's flag? There's multiple traditions, St. Georgian Turkish, So, again, that just shows you how complex and confusing it is. And once you start claiming things for yourself, your identity, then you're essentially robbing someone else of theirs.
This might be a bit of a thought experiment, but given we had lots of patron saints before, George was decided on, how different do you think the English psyche might be if we'd sort of stuck with St. Edmund or Edward the Confessor? Would we have a very different national psyche, do you think, if there wasn't someone killing a dragon involved?
Well, but when you look at, historians have looked at, we talk about in the book, we talk about these, St. George's societies, St. Andrew's societies. So in other words, these groups are in Singapore in the 19th century, or in the United States, or in Australia, or New Zealand, or whatever. And so all these kind of expats, i.e. migrants, immigrants, are celebrating their Englishness or Scottishness or Welshness, and back home they're not. And when you look at what the St. George's societies in America in the 19th century is doing on St. George's Day, they do a toast to the Queen, obviously, and they normally celebrate William Shakespeare. And because William Shakespeare's birthday was the same day as St. George's Day. So, but they're actually, they're not basically putting English bunting out. They're celebrating national figures, and they might have a May Day celebration or whatever. But they're picking on national figures, and you're right. But the Victorians were big on bigging up Alfred and Robin Hood and others and legendary characters as well as historic characters, saying these are the symbols of Englishness today, or these are the symbols of Scottishness. Rob Roy, who was a real person, but then basically became semi-invented by Walter Scott. So fiction and fact blur as to thing, but celebrated figures are quite important. And we've kind of lost that in politics. Everything just becomes around a flag.
I know it's quite funny where I live, because you'll see 3 flags on display. You get the Cross of St. George, which is nearly always wrapped around the flagpole, which I think in and of itself is quite a useful visual metaphor. You've usually got the Union Jack upside down, and the Newcastle United flag, which as far as I'm concerned is really the only acceptable one to be flying. So it does make me laugh. That I think that's one thing that you get here in particular, that the identity is Geordie first, everything else later. which is quite nice. And I think that was what I like the chapter on like games and festivities and things, which really highlighted that like often quite highly local and regional nature of these particular sort of types of traditions and things. And what I was wondering is because social media has kind of flattened out a lot of sense of local and regional, do you think that trends have now replaced those traditions and then we'll just keep cycling through things, or is social media a good way of reminding people that they existed?
I think it does a bit of both, really. I think it so for instance, yesterday I was in Hebden Bridge and I was talking to some people about the annual rubber duck race that I always used to attend when I was young. And they said that it's become so popular now because of social media that most locals just flee. They flee Hebden Bridge the day before, and then all the tourists come in, watch the rubber ducks race down the river, and then leave, and then all the locals come back. So I think social media is really changing the nature of some of these events. It's really broadening it out, and it's making it international, not just national, but international. So it's doing that. It's keeping them going, but it's definitely changing the the shape, the color, the flavor of these events. Don't know whether you've got any examples, Owen, of where social media has really impacted.
Well, I think it's social media is the latest of it, but we talk in the book about the early BBC, for example, and the early independent television, which is broken down into regional units because that's where the signals it's best to do. And so right from the beginning of these fundamental television, it's fundamental to culture, from the 1930s onwards. But it was broken down regionally, and those regional countries were desperate for regional things that people go, oh, that's my place, it's around my corner. Whether it's in Scotland or Wales gets TV a bit later, etc. So, but and radio was the same, BBC Radio, and so right up until 1990s, there was much greater sense that when you turned your TV on or your radio on, you were part of a region, the locality, and that's when your Midland TV would always go back to cheese rolling or pancake flipping at Olney or whatever. And so it created that sense, and I think that's gone. That's largely gone. And I think social media is the latest level of, as you say, completely flattening quite a lot of that as well. So we shouldn't forget the role of 20th century modern media and how that has shaped. Again, moving away from the idea this is all ye olde stuff which all crumble. Actually, the BBC and independent television and radio really important for regional and national identity. Scotland having its own set of programs compared to England's, and Wales as well. And yeah, definitely a flattening, quite right.
Mm. So speaking of trends and obviously how this interacts with the online space, one of the things I was curious about is where is the line between something being a trend and something being a revival of an old craft? Obviously, I'm massively biased because I'm a knitter, and obviously knitting and crochet in particular, and to a lesser extent sewing, have sort of suddenly come back into fashion. And sometimes they're labelled as being like sort of grandma crafts, which I take umbrage at for various reasons. But obviously they've been labelled as trends rather than people pursuing traditional crafts. So do you think that that's a way of acknowledging social media's role, or is it a way of almost kind of denigrating the fact that they are traditional crafts?
Yes, interesting point. It's interesting.
Yeah. I mean, I was going to say it's just a matter of semantics, but you're right. The term trend just kind of, it's quite pejorative, isn't it? And
it's like games, isn't it? The stuff you studied on games. We haven't talked about you, and I think you wrote that section on conkers, Ceri, and how it's changed.
Mm-hmm.
But you can imagine social media whipping up a new conker flurry of interest or whatever. And you say, would that be a trend? But it's not really, because it's basically, there's a history of media picking up on this stuff once again, isn't there?
Yeah, I think it's all dependent on who's looking at it. You can put a kind of not necessarily a negative spin on it, but you can look down on something as just a trend, but a folklorist or the practitioner can see it as a revival or a kind of traditional craft. So I think that, the two are the same. It's just who's looking at them, who's choosing to talk about them or write about them, and how they're perceiving them. So yeah, I think a lot of trends are actually revivals. And yeah, I do wonder, give it a few years, because the conkers are, all the children are collecting conkers, but they don't know what to do with them. All it takes is one good TikToker to kind of give them a game, give them a tradition, and suddenly conkers will be back. So yeah, there you go. If anyone's on TikTok or Instagram, there's a challenge for you.
Started up again, but I mean, there's a reason for why then it's important to understand kind of the history of different aspects of folklore, because otherwise, someone might call it a trend, but it's probably because they're ignorant of its past and the complexity of its history.
Yeah, and I think the thing that fascinates me, particularly with the yarn craft ones, is the way that they're often sort of put across as being like, this is a girly thing to do, and I'm like, but men used to do all the knitting, and I was like, it's for anyone, literally. As long as you can handle the needles, you can knit, and if you can't, then there's knitting machines. But yeah, the other thing that I think comes out quite strongly in the book, obviously, other than traditions, is also just the general nature of belief and how, people have believed, let's say, quite odd things in the past. And I know that there can be a tendency for people to look back and kind of romanticize that as like folk wisdom and so on. But then people will look at, people who share misinformation online, for example, and then go, oh, that's a different thing. But is there a sense that folklore helps us realize that people have always believed odd stuff for one reason or another, and probably will always continue to do so?
Yeah, I think the chapter on kind of the natural world really showed that, didn't it? The kind of that idea that we've, humans in the past were much more at one with nature and had, as you said, this kind of folk wisdom about the natural world. But actually, as you say, there was a lot of misinformation going around, to the detriment of a lot of animals. Owen, do you want to? This is your expertise.
Well, there's also, on the same point, we can look at that, that was being discussed, the transition that fairies decline and suddenly there's UFOs and aliens, and so there has been a debate amongst folklorists and others about is that a direct connection? Otherwise, you lose one kind of fundamental supernatural other and a realm. The fairies are generally underground; they come up sometimes, but generally they're a lower realm than than where we live. And then therefore there's this human need to create a new supernatural other, and that's why UFOs take off. I think it's more complex than that, and we could have UFOs at the same and aliens at the same time as fairies. And obviously there's been a resurgence of people saying they've seen fairies, and we live in a world of UFOs and aliens as well. So I don't necessarily buy there's a direct connection to transition, but what it does show is the ways in which humans can generate new supernatural others. And quite a lot of that is dependent again on culture and media again. Why do UFOs become global and popular? It's primarily down to TV and cinema that embeds it and integrates it, and then belief systems develop around that in different cultures.
Yeah, I think that's something that I think people underestimate, is how much pop culture influences the shape of things. And I mean, obviously, because my specialism's film, and when you look at the way that people describe hauntings now, you're like, that's from the Amityville Horror, that's from Poltergeist, that's from the Conjuring universe. And you even hear people using the language of those films to describe their experiences, but then you end up with a weird thing of what came first, the language to describe it or the experience. And so it's fascinating seeing how all of this works. And do you think that kind of thing is partly the role of a folklorist or a cultural historian, or is that more for linguists to fight over what these different words mean?
Well,
That's for folklorists. Yeah.
I completely. The example I always go back to for this is my local park, Boggart Hall Clough, and there were writings from kind of the 19th century about the boggart. But then you get to kind of the start of the 20th century, and a lot of the kind of older local residents that I interviewed, including my own grandmother, about kind of Boggart Hall Clough, they didn't even know it as Boggart Hall Clough. My nana called it Bucket Hall Clough because she had no concept of what a boggart was. So she just changed the word in her mind, or that's how it kind of was passed on to her. So for a generation, it was Bucket Hall Clough. And then it kind of became boggart, and all the kind of younger people that I talk to about what the boggart is, they're drawing on all this popular culture in their understanding and how they're visualizing what a boggart is. So I think, popular culture has huge influence on people's understanding of folklore. And that doesn't mean to say that they're just making it all up based on the films they've watched, but it's helping them to conceptualize these things. So yeah, from the boggart to the bucket to the boggart again.
And you can see the same processes you're going back to the 17th century when you get the rise of popular chapbooks and popular literature. Because you can take things like the 17th century Jack the Giant Killer, very hugely popular, Jack the Giant, and Tom Thumb. And they're based around the court of King Arthur. It's Arthurian stuff still, people don't realise. But you can trace kind of names in the 17th century literature about giants in Cornwall. And you can see that in late 19th century folklorists picking this up, often assuming it's some sort of oral tradition, but it goes back to cheap literature and the stories being told about Robin Hood and Jack the Giant Killer and King Arthur. And there's a great case of one of the well-known Cornish folklorists in the mid-19th century. It basically goes to Tintagel and asks the curator, the guide there, says, "Have you got any stories about King Arthur?" He says, "Well, I had this book, but I've got it anymore." And that was it. There was no lore apart from this book. So this is an old relationship between media and orality.
Mm. How do we deal with it though when people then start actually sharing stuff that has been made up as part of pop culture? I'm thinking here specifically a discussion I had with Morgan Daimler about the way that like D&D fairy stuff then bleeds back into fairy lore, and people then start confidently sharing stuff that only actually appears in D&D but as folklore. Do we then need to make space for that in folklore and go, actually, yes, everyone's welcome? Or does there need to be a bit of going, well, it's actually a bit of both? That came from a fictional source. It's not actually in the folklore, but isn't it interesting? Is like, how magnanimous do we need to be? And at what point do you have to actually go, that's just wrong?
That's your point about authenticity, isn't it, Karen? Let's come back to that.
Yeah, there is no fake lore. Yeah, folklore, all folklore was created at some point. And as Owen said, a lot of it was printed before it entered oral tradition. So, I would certainly encompass D&D and the worlds that come in with folklore, just like we encompass things that J.R. Tolkien created in our understanding of folklore, and Alan Garner. D&D draws on folklore and then kind of repackages it and puts it back out there. So it's not kind of pure invention, but even if it was, folklore is constantly being created. So yeah, I would think it's all under our remit.
Mm-hmm. And fairies a good example, because people put all sorts of different over the centuries aspects onto what a fairy is, what it looks like. You get some basics, dressing green or whatever. They're small, or sometimes they're not small. Sometimes they're big. But you can pick up any bit of folklore, and people's ideas are going to be shaped by their own individual, by their ideas, by their family, by their community. There isn't some sort of one entity. And the same thing with ghosts. You look at, if you go outside the urban context and you look at ghosts in the countryside and landscape, they might be a spirit of the dead, but actually they appear in the shape of a dog. They haunt a bridge, but no one quite understands why they're haunting at a bridge. It isn't a suicide or anything like that, but they just like bridges. And so trying to find what is authentic and what has been influenced by TV, cinema, chapbooks. It is an interesting exercise to study, but doesn't define it as folklore. Folklore is like this term from the 1950s America, where they're basically saying this is trash, this is media trash, and this is the original oral version of this story from the Appalachians or whatever. But now most folklorists would go, well, that's both of them are folklore. So we kind of the folklore academic folklore has done away with this idea of authenticity. It's all folklore.
Yeah. Do we also need to give like a viewer or a reader or whoever, a consumer of these things, a little bit of credit as well? Because I mean, I did an episode on Poltergeist not so long ago, and I was looking at bits of the historical record where you can go, oh, this part of the film has a precedent in here. Clearly, no child has been eaten by a tree, as far as I'm aware. People haven't been sucked into alternative dimensions through their wardrobe and what have you. Um, but the viewer can twig that that bit mustn't be real. That bit's clearly Hollywood, but then they'll go, but these parts um sound like things from other properties. So do we sometimes have to go, somebody can watch this and go, yeah, that bit's clearly based on folklore or something, but that bit's obviously just Hollywood having some special effects. Is that something that I think we sometimes don't give viewers the credit for?
Yeah, it's that sifting. It's a sifting process. I mean, it's like folklorists normally talk about belief, but there is a folklore of unbelief, where if you're a labourer in 19th century Shropshire or a tool worker in Newcastle in the late 18th century, you might not believe any of the stuff that your neighbours are telling you at all, or make a decision on what they do believe or don't believe. And that we don't pick up so much information about that in the past, but it's absolutely, as you're saying, it's there in the present. That comes down to things like urban legends, but you can talk about conspiracy theories as well. Who believes in, you sift one conspiracy. Do you believe the whole package? In other words, you believe one conspiracy, you believe them all, or you actually, that one's got something to it and that one doesn't. And they're both things happen. There's opinion polls in the States and in our English National Folklore Survey, which the results will be released in a couple of weeks. It's clear that some particularly young people will buy into the whole lot.
Mm-hmm. Do you get that with folklore as well, though, when people maybe will do a practice, then they're not really convinced about it, but they'd rather be on the safe side. Like, for example, my brother moved house, so I got him a horseshoe to put over the door, and he just went along with it because he's good like that. I don't think he's got any belief that that's going to help bring him good luck or anything. I think he, as I say, just thought he was humouring me. But you know, how do we know how much a lot of these things people actually believed, or they just did them because it seemed fun, or everybody else was doing it, or it doesn't hurt, so you might as well. Like, because we never really get a sense that these things have, apart from I think some of the herbal remedies and things, we don't know that people actually did them. So how do we know that someone wasn't just pulling a folklorist's leg and just making stuff up?
Yeah, belief is so difficult to understand and to get to. So I mean, we've worked quite a lot on concealed objects. So things like concealed shoes, bricked up in walls and up chimney breasts and stuff. And kind of there's this tradition that they were placed there to kind of protect against witches and demons and evil spirits. But it's far likelier that it was more a notion of good luck. And kind of by the end of it being practiced, probably being practiced because that's what you do. Like, you hang a horseshoe over your door. If there's a cavity open and you happen to have a spare boot, put it in, because that's what you do. So yeah, belief is very, very difficult to access. But I don't think it's necessarily a case that everybody used to believe and now we do it just because we've always done it and there's no belief. I think it's much more complicated than that. I think that there are examples from the past of people, builders putting a boot up a chimney just as a joke. Whereas today, people who are finding these concealed shoes and then putting a new shoe in its place, actually being quite worried about kind of the negative impact of finding it and taking it out. So yeah, I don't think it's just a kind of trend of decline of belief over time. I think it's much more complicated, but really, really hard to grasp as a folklorist.
And that's what we've explored that in our concepts of modern re-enchantment, where you take a practice which has probably gone down to luck or something, and then someone, as Ceri says, you find it now, and people imbue a lot of meaning and emotion into something which may have just been a casual builder's deposit, and now, because scholars and folklorists and others have told you it's for protection against witches and evil spirits, you believe it, even though that wasn't the aim of the person who put it there. So there's a constant re-enchantment taking place in the contemporary world as well.
I quite like that. I do also wonder, there's a little part of me thinks it would be really lovely if there was a completely mundane reason, like people were basically building up a collection of shoes as like rudimentary like wall insulation or something like that. I would love it if they were that forward thinking. Um, and I think the thing that uh fascinates me as well as when I know you've written Kerry about like love locks and things, how that took off as this massive thing. But even that's now changing its emphasis. And you do sort of think, where can you ever predict where these things are going to end up, or do you just have to wait and see what people will do with them? Because it's a bit like, you know, when you give sort of someone a piece of software and then people will immediately find the bits that don't work because they've used it in a way the developers didn't intend. Do we get that with folklore that it where you can't predict how people are going to use it?
Yeah, I think I really don't think you can. It always surprises you, and I think the important thing to do is to keep watching, and to not dismiss something just because it's modern or a trend or because it was kind of birthed by a film. You know, to keep an eye on it and to expect changes, but to be completely open-minded about what those changes might be. Lovelocks, as you say, are a really fascinating example, and they've become much more than kind of they're not just romantic gestures anymore. They're really kind of heavily imbued in memorialization with kind of grieving rituals. And that's something that, you know, when it first appeared in a kind of teenage Italian romance novel, that I wouldn't have predicted that it would become this really kind of fixed thing in grieving rituals. So yeah, you just got to keep watching them and see where they go.
Cool. And this nicely leads on to my next question, and this is I really like the section on the different types of magical people because I think obviously there is this continual conflation of witches and cunning folk online. So what I wanted to know is, are there any rituals or practices that you do yourselves that might be considered folk magic?
Oh. Ooh, I'm trying to think. Have you got one, Kerry? I'm trying, it's one of the things. It's a bit like I study this so much. You start becoming conscious,
Mhm.
self-conscious about are you doing something you know that may
Yeah.
be considered ritual.
I mean, I participate in so many rituals that are to do with kind of calendar customs, annual rituals that you could view them as kind of folk magic or ritual. You know, I blow candles out on birthday cakes. Um, I I don't like putting shoes on tables. Um, I I'm trying to think. I've carved a pumpkin. So many things that are just kind of part of our yearly traditions, mainly because the supermarket tells us that they are. And I'm a supermarket folklorist. I love the aisles of the supermarket because they really do tell us what rituals, what calendar customs we're kind of expected to participate in, and how they're changing. I saw just the other day a kind of repurposed Easter egg that's being used as a Halloween chocolate. So it's half an Easter egg with like a candy skeleton inside it, and the Easter egg is being used as a coffin, a chocolate coffin. So now we're getting kind of Halloween eggs. Because they've got the mold, they've already got the recipe for it. So kind of seeing how much the supermarket influences our rituals, and again, that doesn't make it inauthentic. What they're identifying is a gap, a gap in the market. People want an excuse to eat chocolate at Halloween, and here we have one, ready made. So yeah, I participate in a lot of rituals, but completely subconsciously. I don't see them as folk magic. I just see them as what we do at this time of year,
Mm.
like everybody.
I remember talking about chocolate eggs a few years ago. Cadbury's brought out the Scream eggs, and it was basically yeah, the regular cream egg, but the inside was green or something, and it didn't taste any different whatsoever. Yes, I'm going to pay an inflated price for something that's got green goo in it. Of course, I have. It's Halloween, but yeah, it's funny seeing how they do that with things. And then obviously how quickly they get rid of the Halloween stuff in favor of the Christmas stuff, which is always poor November just gets completely forgotten about. And speaking of people remixing trends and not trends, traditions, I do the first footing, obviously being in the
Mm.
Northeast. and women aren't supposed to do it. But
Mm.
my dad won't, and we don't like the idea of not doing it, so I do it instead. So, it seems to have worked so far, anecdotally. Um, and my last question, you've got a section in the book on digital folklore, and we've talked a lot about sort of social media and what have you. And I've actually found social media really useful for collecting folklore from people. Like when I did the schools episode, and I thought I don't want to just look through what other people have said. I want to find what weird stories people were told about their schools. And what was really cool is people in the comments were like, "Oh my God, I went there as well. Did you hear this version?" And then they were sort of like comparing notes and whatnot. And that was when Twitter was still Twitter, of course. Um, so what would be some of your favorite examples of digital folklore? And if anybody wanted to practice it, because I think it's a bit more accessible, what should listeners look out for as examples of digital folklore?
It's not in a book, but it's an open access article if anyone wants to read it. I did one on the folklore of ice cream vans, and it's if you just type folklore of ice cream vans, you can get it for free. And that was kind of the first time where actually to get information on the folklore, I used message boards, Reddit and others, quite a lot of regional message boards as well. Some of them, are still up there from 15, 20 years ago. So you actually got kind of 20 years worth of potential material about folklore about that, and that was really quite rich, and particularly about the legends and stories about ice cream vans, at 3 a.m. going 90 miles an hour with the music playing at fast speed and stuff. All this stuff is urban stuff. So you're actually getting some interesting urban material as well as other material. So that was the first time, and I found that I don't think I could have written an article, or anyone could write an article about the folklore of ice creams without basically drawing upon those new forms of social media.
Mm.
So that's mine.
Yeah, I think one of my favorites is I don't know if you know the artist Lucy Wright, and she's just invented this custom called dusking, which you perform on the 31st of October, and it involves kind of going out somewhere and dancing, and she's very explicit in her social media that she invented this. It's pure invention, kind of drawing on kind of her loves of dancing and being out in wild spaces, and celebrating this time of year, as obviously kind of the nights draw in. And just within the last couple of years, it's had this huge following, kind of loads and loads of different groups and individuals participating, and that they're fully aware that this one person invented it. But this desire to be part of it, to be part of a community, this desire to kind of celebrate a time of year that I guess most people are celebrating in quite a different way, trick or treating and things, but something that speaks to them. So I think social media allows for that. It allows for people who maybe don't feel kind of, I don't know, represented by what's going on that time of year. And it doesn't matter to them that it's been invented, and it's been invented for Instagram. It speaks to something that they need and they want. So I'd be really, really interested 10, 20 years to see kind of how established dusking has become. But yeah.
That seems like such a nice, harmless thing to do as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Yeah. There's lots and lots of examples where folklore has been weaponized for kind of bad reasons. But yeah, I think so often they are harmless. They give people something that they want, in a nice way. So I think that's why that's one of my favorite examples.
Cool. So obviously my last question is, obviously this is literally just come out in September, hasn't it?
Yeah.
The inevitable question, what are you working on now? The question every academic hates. So what's the follow-up? And where can people find you online?
I'm currently kind of, which is a bit of a follow-on from that book, but I'm working on a book called Law and Landscape, which is kind of an alternative history of Britain through legends, and essentially an alternative history which is wrong, but which is embedded in myriads of legends which are connected with place.
Sounds cool.
And anyone, if you Google Owen Davies ghosts, witchcraft, or whatever, you'll find me.
And I have taken a break from academic writing, and I am writing some cheesy fiction at the moment, and absolutely loving it. But yeah, you can find me on Blue Sky, Instagram. Google me. I'd love to connect.
Cool. I'll put links in the show notes just to make it easier for people to go clicky rather than anything else. Because who knows what people might accidentally find on Google, let's be honest. But it's been absolutely brilliant talking to you. I hope that people do go out and read the book because obviously it is really, really interesting. I was reading it on the train and people kept like looking over and looking at what I was reading. It's almost like you want to kind of start a discussion with them at the same time. So obviously, I know people listening to this. Obviously, I've got people all over the world, and I know it's obviously very specific to Britain. But I think that's a good place to kind of learn almost the methodology to then apply
Absolutely
outwards, as it were.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you, Isaac.
Thank you for having us.
Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee. Or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below and thanks in advance.